Hello, and welcome to another Infinite Jest reading diary, this time episode 4, where for this video we're featuring a pretty reshuffled video schedule on account of my doing reading diaries for a new spring, the prequel of The Wheel of Time in July, and that only taking 2 weeks instead of the scheduled 3. This video is coming out on what was originally going to be the third diary for that book that turned out being unnecessary, which means it's coming out 2 weeks earlier than originally planned. What does that mean for the series? Well, it doesn't actually really mean that much other than you're getting the content earlier. Most of my schedule hasn't been reshuffled that much, or at least not as much as I was originally thinking it was going to be. I'm still going to struggle a little bit to get the next diary out because I'm going to go ahead and make the 5th and final diary for the book come out in 2 weeks, when this video was originally going to be coming out covering chapter 28, where this week I'm covering chapter 27. So that's what things look like. You're going to get 2 diaries this month, just a couple of weeks apart, covering basically like right around 40% of the entire runtime of the book, or page count of the book. Like, that's actually a pretty absurd amount, but things have been going pretty good over the last however long it was. I think it was just over the last 2 weekends I read chapter 27. It's been a little bit longer than that since the last time I read the book, really since the last one of these diaries, but 2 weekends, 6 days it took me to read right around like 230 or so pages of the book. So that was something that definitely happened this time around. It's just the one chapter as opposed to multiple chapters, but there was a lot in it, a lot to talk about. So let's just, go ahead and jump into the reading diary proper and talk about some of my spoiler-free thoughts on the reading, because this is probably going to be a long video. Now, the last time that we gathered here for an Infinite Jest diary, we discussed my thoughts on a section of the book that I was less enthused about. While I've largely enjoyed the book, I would say that chapters 23 through 26 were kind of along a similar line as the chapters like, 13 through 16-ish, somewhere a span of chapters that were a little bit more messy, a little bit rougher, that featured some stuff that I wasn't as into, featured some longer, duller sections, stuff that felt very largely uneventful and irrelevant, sections that felt drawn out, and like I said, even more irrelevant than usual. I found myself getting a little bit burnt out by the time I got to the last diary and was wondering how well I was going to continue with the book, being as there was like 40% of it left and only 2 chapters. I was like, oh man, how am I going to get through all of this? It turned out that near burnout was exacerbated by feeling edged the entire time, and that's a weird term to use, but let me explain it as basically I felt like the entire time I was reading those chapters 23 through 26, I felt like things were about to click. They were getting there. They were so close. There was some good stuff, but it was like right at the end when it's like, okay, things are probably going to start clicking here pretty soon. And I never felt like they actually started happening that time around. So that reading in diary number 3 was pretty rough to get through, all things considered. This time around, for chapter 27, just about everything within it was great. I'm back on my really hyped wagon over here on my soapbox to shout that Infinite Jest has some of the best material I've ever read in a book, and that is very true for this chapter. There's some very, very good stuff here. Some of this material expands upon previous favorite scenes or two. That's some of the best material, like I just mentioned just a few seconds ago. There was also plenty more stuff from ETA this time around, whereas the last diary I felt like most of the material centered around Ennet House, and a lot of that Ennet House stuff was kind of mediocre. It was just, it kind of existed, and that was right about the best that I could say for it at the time. But like I said, this chapter has a little bit more about ETA itself, both tennis related stuff specifically, but there's also some other stuff that's kind of causing it to hook into some of the other plot lines there as well, which we'll of course get into in the spoiler section. The very end of the chapter is also a pretty good example of weird stuff in accordance with the ETA plotline type stuff. But like I said, we will get to that. On top of all of this enjoyableness, threads are actually coming together. So whereas with chapters 23 through 26, like I said, I felt like I was just getting edged the entire time with the promise that things were going to click, that something was going to happen, and like it never did. This time around, things are actually starting to happen, and there's enough clicking together in enough places that I'm actually super anxious to read chapter 28, which I guess works because at the time that this video comes out on Thursday, I'm going to be spending the next 3 days reading that chapter, and then the same 3 days the following week to finish up the chapter, so that the next diary can come out 2 weeks from today, covering the end of the book, basically. But yeah, there are some threads coming together. So some of the Ennet House stuff, it was a bit in the background this time around on account of Gately's condition following after the reading from last diary. But there is some stuff with the ETA plotline and the Meredith Steepley plotline, both sides of it here actually, that have moved on to new narrative pastures. That has been pretty fun. And the trajectory of basically everything is looking pretty solid. So with that said, let's actually jump into the spoilers now and what actually happened in the reading. But because this is covering one chapter, well, instead of obviously covering the material of what happened chapter by chapter, we're going to talk about it in terms of days. Over the 6 days that I read the book, what happened each day of reading, more or less. So let's just jump right into it. There's plenty to get through here. My notes for this week are 2,000 words long, whereas the last two diaries featured like only around 1,500 words of notes. So like I said, let's just jump into the spoiler stuff for day 1, the stuff that happened on the first day of reading for chapter 27. Well, it wasn't looking good at first, I will admit, because the chapter did start off with what I thought was a pretty irrelevant little bit. We returned to the engineer, the sound engineer from the 60 Minutes, more or less, with Madame Psychosis. Had a little POV section from this engineer. Like, there was a little bit of POV from this character earlier in the book. This time around, he's observing some sort of gathering that's watching something related to some statue or pond or other or something like that. I'm really not sure what happened in this scene. I feel like I should bring it up because maybe it's important for something, but overall I just don't really know what purpose the scene served, so that it just kind of existed. But that was only a few pages long. Once we got into the actual meat of the chapter, over the rest of the reading, there was plenty of good stuff. We actually got some material from all 3 of the major plot lines at that point. The 3 major plot lines were the ETA stuff, the Ennet House stuff, and the Meredith Steepley stuff. Starting with the ETA material, stuff that wasn't directly plot related, but actually hints at some of the material to come. Now that I think about it, you know, hindsight is 2020. We start off with a cafeteria lunchroom type of setting with a conversation between several of the ETA students. Hal is one of the students that is there. There is a mention within the narration, the thing that I really latched onto with this section, that Hal is trying to get clean from drugs. Now the reasons that motivate this and how long he's been trying to be clean and whatnot is stuff that the rest of the chapter really goes to in depth. But this chapter basically just mentions that he's trying to get clean and that he wants to submit his own urine test for once. That's one of the driving factors. You're like, okay, so there's a little change to Hal here. How is this going to change? And then you start to see a little bit of that happen over the rest of the chapter. There's also a brief mention in the section about Ortho Stice beating Hal in tennis that day, which is also something that gets a little bit more screen time later in the chapter as well. So that's the ETA stuff that happened in day 1's reading. The Meredith Steepley plotline stuff that happened here was basically the end of the Meredith Steepley plotline as the entire book has featured it up to this point. So Steepley, this was actually one of my favorite sections of this plotline as well. Steepley tells Meredith the story of his father falling into a sort of addiction type of obsession. In this case, it was an obsession with the TV show MASH from the 70s. We get a good look at the way that these obsessions can start. We get a good impression of how innocent some of these types of things can be, just a hobby or something that a person enjoys, that can occasionally progress into a debilitation over the course of years. And unchecked obsession, obviously the thematic ties to addiction are quite great in this section and very obvious. Even though Steepley never puts it as an addiction with the show, it's pretty obvious what David Foster Wallace is getting at with this segment, and the way that overall this little segment emulates Infinite Jest, the film, the purpose of the film, somebody becoming so engrossed with the film or with a substance of entertainment that they are willing to die just to be watching it all the time, which ultimately Steeply's father does. And the segment also continues to be rather humorous for me personally, because it once again emphasizes the fact that it's quite obvious what the problem with the entertainment, or what the problem with Infinite Jest as it exists is, locking somebody into a debilitating state of obsession that effectively kills them. But Meredith supposedly continues to fail to see the issue with this. The dichotomy between Meredith and Steeply here is still funny and still rather entertaining, but I found this segment of the Meredith Steeply plotline to be great, and especially as this part of the plotline here ends, because all of this Meredith Steeply stuff that's happened in the book so far has basically happened on the night of April 31st through May 1st over the course of the year of the Dependable Undergarment, which is 2009. And this is where this segment ends here. The rest of the Meredith Steeply stuff that happens throughout the chapter is actually concurrent with the rest of the events of, well, basically the entire book for the most part, which is November 2009, so a few months later. Finally, the Ennet House material that does happen over the course of day one's reading of chapter 27 is some stuff that I admit I'm not necessarily too sure about. It was a scene of several of the Ennet House members just kind of gathered together having a conversation between them. Some of it is a little bit relevant to Gately's injuries incurred from the last chapter at the end of 26, but mostly it's not. It seems like a few old characters, namely Kate Gompert, maybe Erdetti's, whatever his name is involved here as well, are kind of involved with this conversation. I note these because Kate Gompert specifically is from the psych ward chapters early in the book that I loved so much, and then the other character whose name I can't pronounce, Erdetti or whatever his name is I learned while looking through some stuff earlier from the book today, is actually the character from chapter 2. I don't remember if he was actually in this conversation, but maybe he was. And if he was, maybe he was the one talking about the billowing shape that kind of affects him personally, some sort of trauma from when he was younger, but I don't know if that was him. That was probably a different character. It might very well have been a different character. I don't remember the names too well, and I don't necessarily remember what the purpose of the scene was, all things considered. Again, I'm not too sure about it, but that's kind of the little gist of what was going on there. But that was how my reading for day one went. So there was some pretty good stuff there with the Meredith Steeply plot line, and some intriguing stuff with the ETA plot line. The other stuff I wasn't quite so sure about, but it was days 2 and 3 where things really started to pick up with the chapter. First off, for day 2 of the reading, I will say the main thing that I got from this part of the chapter that I'm very embarrassed to finally be saying now, which I didn't comment on earlier, despite the fact that I definitely had suspicions and was suspecting a few chapters earlier about this aspect, but felt too stupid to say anything for some reason because I wasn't sure if I was right, and if I was wrong I would have felt even more stupid than I do right now for saying it now. Steeply is at ETA in this scene trying to get a talk with Hal, and Helen and Hugh Steeply are the same person. So obviously from the Meredith Steeply plotline, even though it takes place several months before any of the rest of this material, for some reason my brain continued to think about it as happening concurrently, so I didn't feel like this Hugh Steeply, who was obviously dressed in drag as kind of an undercover agent throughout, the whole conversation. It's made such a big point that it should be obvious, but for some reason I didn't really connect that with that being the same Helen Steeply whom Oren tells Hal about over phone calls, and who is now at ETA and has had other correspondences in the book up to this point. For some reason, it just didn't connect for me that they're the same character, because like I said, I felt like the Meredith Steeply plotline was happening concurrently, even though it obviously wasn't. So my brain was just a little confused for a long time. I was starting to have some suspicions during my reading for the last diary, but I didn't mention it at any point last diary because I was so uncertain of it and felt so dumb that I just didn't feel like I needed to mention it. But now I'm mentioning it now and feel dumb anyway, so that's just kind of how that went. I know it's really obvious, I know I'm dumb, but I genuinely wasn't sure up to this point. So yeah, the references made to Steeply here within this chapter make it absolutely 100% clear and obvious, no doubts about it, impossible to have any doubts about it, quite frankly. But anyway, Hal and Stice are having a tennis match, kind of one of the things foreshadowed from the lunchroom conversation that I mentioned earlier. This match also features Stice being pretty stiff competition for Hal, something that seems a little bit odd, that seems a little bit unlikely. The brief bit of the actual tennis match that was told in this chapter was pretty good, and as with all of the other tennis stuff within the book, I wish there was more of it because I'm engrossed by the way that David Foster Wallace actually writes about the tennis matches. So that's good stuff. But at one point, after a few pages of the match itself, the POV switches to Steeply watching over the match and having like a sort of dialogue of sorts with Poutrincourt, one of the teachers, the one that kind of teaches about like the sort of Canadian and US like relationship, you know, the interdependence type of stuff, has a class that Hal took from earlier in the book that is talked about. She's the instructor for that. And then Delint is also there, basically telling about the intricacies of the match, explaining all of that to Steeply. It feels entertainingly satirical, this whole bit. Also, the Steeply POV references the correspondences with Oren, so again, kind of confirming the Hugh-Helen coordination here. But Steeply is here, not just trying to get a talk with Hal, but also trying to kind of suss out the location of the entertainment of the original Infinite Jest cartridge, and doing so basically with just as much effort as the AFR is. So it seems like both of these government agencies, and well, the AFR isn't government based, but you know what I mean. These two different agencies, these groups of people are basically after the same thing and getting pretty close at the same time. But again, as far as the AFR is concerned, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. This, of course, all of this tennis match is broken up with letters, is broken up in the middle with a series of letters between Steeply as Helen Steeply and an ex-ETA student. That student happens to be Marlon Bain, Oren's old doubles partner from when he was at ETA. So here we get a little bit of Oren's backstory as some of these letters of correspondence, Marlon Bain answering some of Helen Steeply's questions about Oren and about their relationship when they were at ETA. We'll all circle back on a little bit of this a tiny bit later, but some of these conversations, some of this backstory on Oren was pretty interesting, and I thought was worth getting. Also, in the middle of all this chapter, there was a little bit of a section from some of the old Eschaton players who were acting out on a punishment that they were given, where they have to be below the tennis courts. So there's a series of tunnels below the tennis courts here, and they're cleaning up some trash from the tunnels. That was an entertaining scene where they come across an old student's completely full fridge that has been rotting for like a year, which is pretty gross, but that is something that happens in this chapter. And finally, there's also a little bit that I read on day 2 about a kid named Maddie, who I think is Pemulus's brother, I believe is what was suggested here. This kid, or he's an adult now, is in some sort of setting experiencing like some sort of trauma or PTSD type stuff from childhood abuse. I think you know what I'm trying to say here. Abuse at the hands of his father, who immensely mistreated him. I'm unsure if this suggests that Pemulus himself from ETA got mistreated as well. I'm not sure, but seriously, it seems like Pemulus had a pretty primary bad influence here, considering that Maddie and Pemulus kind of had close correspondence when some of this stuff was happening to Maddie, and we kind of see through the rest of the chapter that Pemulus has kind of some stuff wrong with him as well, so like it's kind of undeterminable at this point what happened to which one or both. As for day 3 of the reading, we get to start off with a scene that I was very confused by at first, a scene of a character called Kraus, who I feel like I remember from some other point in the book, but I genuinely don't remember one way or the other what he might have been from. Turns out this guy is committing a burglary, which we will get to soon. That's how this section of this like subchapter of chapter 27 opened, but this was followed with several moments that were very, very great material from the book, some of my favorite material in the book as a whole. We got a great train of content defining depression, especially in various contexts. So if you'll remember, one of my favorite scenes from earlier in the book was the psych ward stuff with Kate Gompert, defining depression and kind of her situation there. So Kate Gompert in the psych ward, you get a little bit of depression defined in this context. We get it defined in the context of a train enthusiast whom she meets at one point, and we get it defined a little bit in the context of both Hal and himself, or James Oren Incandenza, or JOI, thrown in there as well. Some of this material defining depression and the way that David Foster Wallace is able to do so, very, very effective, very great here. We also meet a new character pretty shortly after this, a character named Ruth Van Cleve. We learn a little bit of her backstory, being that she abandoned her baby, which is pretty terrible, but we also learn that her baby daddy's a drug dealer in the most hilarious fashion. I believe it was defined in some sense that he was put in prison, or he is being charged for distributing like pharmaceuticals without a license or something like that, but we get pretty heavy implication that it's because he's just straight up a drug dealer. So that was kind of funny. That was an entertaining moment in the chapter. But then all of this, after meeting Ruth and having a little bit of depression defined by Kate Gompert, we follow Kate and Ruth being on a walk together for whatever reason. I forget what the reason was, but they are on a walk together until they are mugged. Mugged, we learn later, by Kraus, definitely by Kraus. Again, more on this tiny bit, because Kate is smacked into a pole and helped into a bar nearby. I think a bar nearby, but like I said, we'll get to this in a little bit. There's tons of material within day 3's reading on James Oren Incandenza's filmography, because of Hal watching tapes of stuff back at ETA while he's, dealing with withdrawals from having stopped weed completely cold turkey. There's plenty with brief info bursts here, all calling back to the chapter 8 end note. As you'll recall, at chapter 8 end note, the big one was like the 10-page filmography, so there's like little hints at various different films that are given throughout this chapter here. There's a good portion of the chapter dedicated to everybody watching the film Blood Sister, which spoke to my appreciation for David Foster Wallace, his commitment to the bit with this book, which is something also exemplified a little bit later by the AFR material, but the commitment to the bit to just completely define and give an excessive synopsis of this Blood Sister film, a completely made up film that was pretty long, but it was absolutely hilarious. It also specifically has a lot of obvious religious and addiction imagery and subtext to it that is directly relevant to the whole book. Religion stuff, a little bit more on the Ennett House type of stuff. Addiction stuff is basically a through line of the entire novel itself. A lot of great material here. And then this scene with everybody watching Blood Sister also transitions absolutely brilliantly into the best Joelle Van Dyne scene that we've had thus far in the book, where she is watching / partaking in a Cocaine Anonymous meeting. The man speaking at this meeting relays his experience of wasting his last paycheck that he has to be able to spend on his family because he keeps wasting too much paychecks on drugs. He's committed that he's not going to spend it on drugs, but then ends up spending it on the drugs anyway out of irresponsibility and stupidity. So his family ends up going to a support home. He checks himself in to get some help as well. Everything about this section was very moving. The overall ramifications and emotions involved with the whole scene were perfect for me. It was just great. There was also, at the very end, basically a chaotic Randy Lenz scene, which I thought was the mugging of, Kate and Ruth from earlier, but it seems to me to just be like paralleling that scene in some way, though I'm unsure of the reasons. I'm not sure if we're going to get anything more about Randy Lenz in the book. He just kind of seemed to be a kind of one-off character for some of the events at Ennett House, and that was it. I don't know if he'll come back or not. Maybe he will, maybe he won't. But day 3's reading for chapter 27, absolutely brilliant. Some of my favorite stuff in the book, between the synopsis of Blood Sister and that transitioning into the Cocaine Anonymous meeting, having the defining depression in various contexts with Kate and Hal and himself, and really, really, really great stuff here. But now we move on to the last 3 days of reading, which should be a little bit easier to get through and theoretically get through a little bit quicker, because these were all actually individual subchapters, where the previous 3 days of reading had multiple subchapters. So a lot of material to cover. These ones are a little bit more condensed, I feel like. But first, we'll start off with saying that day 3 actually ended with a little bit of the AFR search for the original Infinite Jest cartridge, which was expanded a little bit more on in day 4's reading. So that's why I've kind of bunched them together here in this moment. We get a scene of Marith entering Ennet House under false pretenses so that he can search around for the original Infinite Jest cartridge. It seems the AFR are doing this largely everywhere. There's larger groups or certain groups of people doing this at various different locations, it seems like. Marith also learns from checking into Ennet House that Joelle is here. She is disfigured, so he pretends to be disfigured as a way of kind of like being able to bond with her, so maybe trying to figure out some information from her specifically. He knows there's some entertainment here to be able to peruse to see if he can find the Infinite Jest cartridge, and he also learns at the very end of his little segment here that there's been more recently some tapes coming from ETA itself, specifically down to Ennet House. That's kind of been like donated or loaned for the moment, so we might get a scene of him searching through some of this material in the next chapter. We will see. But going alongside all this stuff with Marith, there's also material with 40A, his boss, technically, the one that he's pretending to betray but is also actually betraying at the same time. He is wherever he's at. I don't actually know where he's at. I didn't get a good read on that, but he's basically doing the same thing. He has his own crew of volunteer viewers set for locating the film to some degree, which it seems like they find one. I'm not entirely sure how this went down, but it seems like they found one, but I think it's just a read-only cartridge, so it's not the original, so they're still looking for the original because they want to be able to make copies. The AFR wants to make copies and disseminate it everywhere, I guess, as a terrorist tactic. I think that's kind of what's going down here, so that's kind of what's happening. We'll kind of discuss this aspect a little bit later in context of a different character. Like I said, that'll happen a little bit later. This is also the section that contains EndNote 304, so the big long 10-page subchapter, and there's also some other AFR related endnotes here as well, which means the context of knowing these characters actually makes a lot of it make sense. We get a little bit of a backstory through some sort of frame narrative to some degree, explaining what the AFR is and how these characters, you know, end up the way they do, what their commitment is, what's kind of going on with the AFR. Compared to reading this endnote at like the 10% mark or wherever it was pretty early in the book when it's first referenced in a different endnote early on, it was so much more clear and easy to understand this time around, that is for sure. There's also some more Joelle POV in day 4's reading. Some OCD cleaning at Ennet House is basically what's going on in this one, with the cleaning being intermixed with her recollecting, whatever the word is pronounced, I don't even know in this context, her association with Oren back when she was a little bit younger. We already got a little bit earlier in the book how they met, how Joelle and Oren actually met and kind of became engaged with each other. This time we get a little bit on how she met James Oren in Cadenza, how Oren made her familiar with his father. There's some interesting Incandenza family lore here between Oren and James, and the kind of family dynamics as far as Joelle's concerned as well, from an outside perspective that is pretty interesting from this material. Day 5's reading has some other good stuff in it. Remember when I said earlier about Kate getting smacked into a pole after being mugged and how we would talk about that later? This is when we talk about that later, because now she's talking with Marith. After she hit that pole and ended up in a building nearby or whatever, it's Marith who she is talking with. This scene, this conversation between Kate and Marith is absolutely hilarious because Marith seems to be pretty drunk. He gives his background plus his wife's background to Kate. Kate kind of relates to it at first, tells him she totally identifies with him and all that nonsense, before she discovers that Marith is actually kind of just a whack job, just a really weird dude who doesn't actually really make that much sense. Absolutely hilarious scene. There's also some other funny stuff in this section of the book because the focus is largely on Mario's POV. So Mario in Cadenza, he's going on a documentary tour of ETA, talking with a few students, just kind of getting some footage for something that he is working on. He also talks in depth at the end of his little POV segment here with the moms, his mother, Avril, Incandenza. Their relationship and dialogue was pretty great. There's also a portion where Hal talks with him about his getting clean and quitting weed and the struggles around that. We get a little bit of insight to Hal's headspace, which is enlightening here, and also similar to Mario's relationship with Avril. Mario and Hal's relationship is pretty great, so a lot of great material in this section. And then also to note on the Mario Hal kind of dynamic, and how Hal, I have a bad accent that makes the word Hal and the name Hal sound like the same thing, so I'm sorry about that. We also get a little bit, the dynamic between Mario and Hal, where Hal basically explains how he's getting off weed. There's a little bit of an end note in this section as well that has a kind of a similar discussion between Hal and Pemulus. Pemulus basically tells Hal that quitting addiction is impossible, that's literally what addiction is. So yeah, that end note stuff was pretty dismal. What a piece of work Pemulus has kind of turned out to be. We kind of see just kind of how garbage of a person he really seems to be overall, but it is still kind of funny. But now we move on to day 6, the final subchapter of chapter 27, and all the stuff associated therein. There's a few big points to get through. Speaking of Pemulus, as we just did at the end of day 5's reading, there's a couple story endnotes within this portion of chapter 27 here that just didn't need to be endnotes. I found it a little bit weird. This is kind of a side note tangent. There was genuinely no reason for these endnotes to be endnotes, because where they're placed, they're just relevant enough to just be part of the actual chapter itself, just like anything else in the book. So that decision was a little bit weird and kind of indulgent on Wallace's part, because there was no reason for these two endnotes to be endnotes. But whatever. Anyway, these endnotes cover Pemulus conversing with Postlethwaite, making him out to be a lunatic, or rather, these endnotes make Pemulus out to be kind of a lunatic. There's also some in one of the endnotes about something that happened to John Wayne, where he was kind of talking over the intercom about people in a bad way, and I think this might have been like sort of drug related, and Pemulus is already kind of on the hooks, or on the rocks rather, for drug related stuff. This is why Hal is more or less being forced to be clean, because he and Pemulus are both having to do this, because the school's, I guess, kind of trying to get Pemulus kicked out. They're trying to give him the boot, and this is one of the ways they're trying to do that, because following the Interdependence Day eschaton stuff, Hal, like I said, kind of had to go clean, Pemulus too, so this is just to get at Pemulus. There's a lot of weird specific stuff going on here that I'm not 100% sure I understand, but yeah, these two endnotes did not need to be endnotes. They should have just put part of the main chapter, because they basically were. So like, one of the things that the book does is in the middle of chapters, it'll have like, let's see if I can find a good example just randomly in the middle of the book. There's like little spaces, there's big spaces like this in between certain sections, and when that happens, it usually means there's a change of POV, and oftentimes chapters or subchapters will have multiple instances of this, where it's switching from one POV to another, then back again, kind of just splitting out the information from these POVs and from these sections into multiple sections. And that's basically what this section of chapter 27 did. Like, that's literally what it did. It had those gaps, end note number, and then another gap onto the next section. So there's no reason why the end note shouldn't have just been in the main chapter. It did that with both of these two story end notes. Like I said, really dumb decision, quite frankly, but whatever. Moving back to the other content of the actual chapter, not these two story end notes, but the rest of the story within the chapter itself. This section of day 6's reading actually started with going back to Hal, and starting with him essentially entering Ennet House, not admitting himself into it, but going into there looking for information on Narcotics Anonymous meeting locations, which we will come to a little bit shortly. We also got a great list of information in the middle of this section here regarding Joel and James Orin and Incandenza and Orin and Infinite Jest, a bunch of information relayed by a character called Molly Notkins, which I recognize the name for some reason. Please tell me why I recognize that name. Like I said, just a bunch of information relayed by this character to the USOUS. Whether the information is all accurate or not is kind of hard to tell. There's some of it that kind of seems blatantly inaccurate because of some names being not fully enmeshed and not actually accurate to the characters' names, but some of the information seems to be accurate compared to what we've heard before. So there's a lot of information here that is relayed that is enlightening, but we're not entirely sure how accurate all of it is, or at least I'm not. But either way, whether that information is accurate or not, she is giving it to the USOUS, which is pretty interesting. The chapter specifically name drops a character named Tyne, which I think is part of President Gentle's administration and also kind of the head of this administration, or the head of this organization that I think is the one that Steeply works for, if I'm not mistaken. I might be wrong on that, but I feel like that's kind of what's going on. Am I right on that? Side note, please let me know one way or the other whether I'm right on all of that, and if I should recognize Molly Notkin's name, because I feel like I should, but I don't. Either way, great material. All the information that was given to us about all of the Infinite Jest and Orin and Joelle and whatever was good. Like I said, I'm not sure if it's all accurate, but the material was pretty good to read nonetheless. But to end the chapter was a 13-page section that pays off on the beginning of day 6's reading about how going to Ennet House for information on NA meetings. So he does actually get a pamphlet from Ennet House, but we learn a little bit later that that pamphlet is outdated. So he goes to an out-of-the-way meeting that isn't actually drug related at all because the pamphlet's outdated, so this location isn't actually accurate. Instead, it's about inner infants, a group of adult men that kind of go for a therapy session, trying to let out their inner infants, talking about like sort of some of their trauma from their childhood and this kind of stuff. Really, really awkward and goofy. What the heck did I just read type of scene, but it was also really funny in like the most morbidly unfortunate type of way. And it just kind of seemed all kind of weird. Like, it seemed, why did we have this scene when Hal could have just gone to a normal NA meeting and had some really good material here? But there's also something about this that seems like it might be sort of relevant anyway, because this meeting specifically that Hal walks in on is centered around a character called Kevin Bain. He's the primary subject. If you recognize the name Bain, it's because Kevin Bain is the older brother of Marlon Bain, who is Orin's old doubles partner, whom Hugh/Helen Steeply questions about Orin and their relationship earlier in this very chapter. Very goofy scene. I was hoping for Hal and NA, but this was just weird. Not sure the relevance to the rest of the book for sure, but it was a goofy scene to end out the chapter, that is for sure. As for some of the more theory-related talk, because we've just kind of summarized more or less what I just read over the last couple of weeks, basically. Clearly, let's just talk about the theories from last time. Clearly, my theory that Mario witnessed the Ennet House mix-up was wrong. I was right, however, about Meredith and Steeply plotline being close to done, because now they're kind of on their own narrative plot lines now. Between Steeply going to ETA after having been in Arizona, apparently, and Meredith going to Ennet House to search for film cartridges. Furthermore, their respective organizations have things going on as well to kind of continue this plot. The OUS, because I'm pretty sure Steeply's part of this, obviously just interrogated Molly about Joelle and the Infinite Jest cartridge. The AFR is making their own push to locate the original Infinite Jest cartridge. A lot of material in there that has been going on. My guess is from now on that there's going to be even more convergence of plot lines to come. Whether the Infinite Jest cartridge is actually found or not, I don't know, but I'm definitely interested to find out one way or the other. Furthermore, I'm also looking forward to seeing what's to come of the main cast. So there's a few different groups of this. There's Joelle and Gately, even Kate, who's not main cast, from the Ennet House type of stuff, to see what's to come from all of them. I'm curious to see what happens to Gately now, or if he's just out of the narrative now after his injury, if he's served his purpose and now he's just gone or something like that. I don't know. There's Hal and Mario and Avril, so all of the Ennet, or all the ETA specific characters. I'm curious to see kind of what goes down with ETA itself, which we'll talk about in just the next section, the conclusion of this real quick. We'll touch on that a little bit briefly. And then there's also the Merith steeply, their respective families and their respective organizations, all that stuff going on. So much exciting possibilities for this last chapter and the final 175 pages of the book, which I'll be discussing in 2 weeks in the next Infinite Jest diary, assuming I'm able to get everything done. We'll see. There's kind of some family stuff going on that may or may not affect how this goes, which I'm not going to dwell on or think about for the moment. As for the conclusion, you'll get to see my impressions of all that, like I said, in just 2 weeks. Chapter 27 took me just 6 mornings to read, so 2 weekends. Chapter 28 is scheduled for the same amount of time because it's more or less the same amount of pages. I also hope to reread, however, chapters 1 and 3 of the book after I finish reading chapter 28, and I hope to be able to include that content in the next diary. Now, the reason I want to do this, chapter 1 for sure, because, well, I've kind of gone back and looked at some stuff, and it's pretty obvious. Chapter 1 is the chronologically last thing that happens in the very book, so I feel like I kind of have to reread chapter 1 after finishing the book to get a little bit more context and maybe even closure on that front. So that'll be interesting to do. And then chapter 3 I personally want to reread because I'm pretty sure that takes place on the day that James Orrin Incandenza dies, and I felt like I was pretty confused about what was going on in some of those early chapters because of the time jumps, and because I wasn't sure from the early chapters seeming like, oh well, Hal's father is already dead, but it seems like he's alive in this chapter, so what's actually going on here? So I'm pretty sure now that I understand a lot more of the context behind that chapter 3 will make a lot more sense, so I'm curious to reread that. So if I can get those chapters reread, as well as having read chapter 28 here in 2 weeks for that diary, I'll cover those in that diary as well, and how that kind of affects the full circle experience for the book. So that's the idea of what's to come. Infinite Jest might just be coming together now. It has definitely started to do that, and I'm on the final stretch, which is very exciting. But since this might very well be the longest Infinite Jest diary, if not, it's pretty close to as long as the first one, which is the longest up to this point, I'm going to go ahead and get out of your face. I'll see you guys in just 2 weeks, so no big deal. It'll be just a couple weeks, and I should be back. If I'm not, it's because of other stuff going on, and that means that I'll have to reschedule or reshuffle the video schedule through August pretty severely, but you know, that's just kind of how things go. We'll figure it out. Expect me in 2 weeks, because that should be when I happen to be back. Thank you for watching. I'll be back in the next video, whatever that might be.